let me just say that climate change as a policy problem is one that countries approach differently through the use of a very different instruments. To some extent, they rely on trying to change people's behavior or try to influence them to change their own behavior.
Social engineering.
Yes, to some extent, they rely upon regulation. To some extent, they rely upon taxation or pricing. And to some extent, they rely on much more direct and extensive controls. The flight shaming phenomenon, which is one in which some people seek to make others feel that they're guilty because of their sin of emitting greenhouse gas emissions,
Yeah.
is kind of a trick that's stolen out of the Middle Ages, if you think about it, when a person was shunned by the community when they did something immoral, and
Walk of shame.
the walk of shame, or they had to wear some sort of a sign on their clothing
Or masks in some cultures, did you know?
yes,
In
yes.
Germany, they had a shame mask, it was called. So that's really interesting.
Oh, I hadn't heard of that.
Yeah.
So it's an extension of that mentality, and in fact, the use of offsets, which are really prices, to add cost to those who fly, is kind of like a form of indulgences from the Middle Ages, when the church said you can have your sins forgiven if you pay a price, and for this sin had that price, and that sin had that price, and so on. So there's a very kind of religious connotation behind it, because they want to make you believe that this is a moral issue. It isn't, but then that's a long discussion. But and so the question is partly to what extent will that extend from its base in Europe to countries like Canada. It already has to some extent in terms of the use of regulation and the use of pricing. I don't think that it will extend to flight shaming, but one can be surprised in this area.
I personally think that the flight shaming has taken a strange veil under the coronavirus pandemic, because I've been seeing a lot of propagandized articles that are associated with a flight from WestJet from here to there had 40 coronavirus cases. So it's flight from so-and-so to so-and-so. So anything that I've been seeing, because as I said, I've been doing much research on the aviation topic. So every article that I'm seeing that actually involves flying involves some kind of shame. But it's not about the GHGs anymore, the greenhouse gases. It's actually about getting infected or infecting other people, or how you shouldn't be you shouldn't be taking a plane anymore. So I feel like there's a sneaky way of doing the same thing, and that's my opinion, and it's just something that I've been noticing.
It's the use of social pressure, of peer pressure, has been very much a part of the approach that people in Canada have used to try to reduce the spread of the coronavirus. It's here in Ottawa, and just over the river in Gatineau. It's quite amazing because it has extended to the practice of telling on your neighbors.
That's scary, isn't it?
Oh yeah, indeed it is. Well, I mean, it basically they have set up these snitch lines, so that if someone sees a neighbor having too many people come into their house, or if sitting in the backyard having a barbecue with too many people there, they'll call the snitch line, and a bylaw officer will come and impose a fine. And that's really a kind of a scary type of development, if you think about it, because it's a betrayal of the normal relationships that one would like to have with one's neighbors.
Yep.
And it kind of reflects the notion that The governments are now establishing the standards of appropriate behavior. And if you don't conform with the behavior that the government has endorsed,
Right.
you will be penalized. And not only that, your friends will tell on you. I mean,
Right.
it's God knows where this is all heading. I hope that we're going to kind of reach the end of it soon.
Well, that's really, I'm glad that you brought up that point. That's something that was a tactic heavily used in the USSR, for example.
Exactly.
Right? That was where things began. It was telling on your neighbors. And that's, and I think that that combined as well, if you look at the masking, which really depersonalizes people, and I'm not saying that I'm an anti-masker or anything of the sort, but just the symbol of the mask as well. If you go into the grocery store and you can't really read expressions anymore, there's no conversation that happens, there's no interaction, and this has been going on and on and on for months now, so it's really depersonalizing people. And then you have that kind of situation where, you know, you might be afraid to talk to your neighbor because now you look at them as a virus carrier rather than a human being, and so then it becomes easier to call the snitch line than it was maybe last year.
Yeah.
So there's an interesting psychological experiment that I think is taking place here, and that's a topic for another interview.
Yes.
But I'm glad that you brought that up. Yeah, it's quite scary, and so this also actually leads me to have less faith in our current government when they're doing things like this and when they're telling us how to behave, and if not, we'll give you a fine. So, you know, we'll take away your jobs, we'll take away your salaries, we'll take away many liberties that you have, and we're also going to fine you if you don't do what we say. So now there's really this intimidation kind of going on, and so that for me doesn't really make a public servant, which is what government is supposed to do, is serve the public. It feels more like we are the servants to the government. So there's kind of been this role reversal in what it should be. And so therefore, yeah, I don't have much trust in our current government. So it makes it easier for me to come to the conclusion that there are some dark things going on, because there are dark things going on. And so I can translate that to the aviation industry in Canada. And for me, I hypothesize that, you know, the Canadian government, quite frankly, is taking advantage of this pandemic and not bailing out its airlines, because it actually does get them closer to some GHG target emissions reductions. So that basically, at this point, we are at, let's say, I think you might be familiar with the figures more than I am, but somewhere around 85% reduction in aviation operations. So that would mean a similar reduction in emissions. And that's just fine, because that's, you know, allowing us to get closer to the 2030 targets, allowing us to get closer to the targets that CORSIA would like to implement, for example. And it's kind of a fast track to reducing emissions. It's a good experiment as well to see what can we do if we downsize the aviation industry. Will we get closer to our targets? And we know, this is a fact, that in Europe they actually want to downsize the aviation industry. It's been stated that, for example, for Air France, one of the bailout conditions was that they had to reduce their emissions, their GHG emissions, and they also had to promote rail travel for any distances under 2 hours, as you were saying before. So it's actually being implemented by regulation now as a bailout condition for something that the government actually imposed upon its airlines by closing the borders, by adding these quarantines, by effectively shutting down the aviation industry, and then saying, okay, well, if you're going to reset, if you're going to restart it, you're only able to do it in the way that we will regulate you. And I think that that's really shameful. I think that that should be more transparent. I don't think a lot of people know about that. And so this is a goal in Europe. And so it makes me wonder, is it also a goal in Canada?
Well, it's difficult to say that the aviation industry is being singled out because the effect of federal government climate policies have been fairly negative for several sectors of the Canadian economy, notably for the petroleum industry, but also for the electrical power industry and increasingly for small industry all across the country. You're quite right that it's the approach that the government has taken to providing financial assistance to the aviation industry is a bit anomalous. I mean, in the sense that there certainly has been substantial funding provided for the automotive industry, and they have continued to provide assistance of various kinds to some of the aircraft manufacturers.
And
like
they said as well for the
Bombardier.
automotive industry that they would be pushing for electric vehicles as well. I just want to say that could be part of the conditions.
There almost always is a condition applied that links to the government's climate policies. But let's kind of look at this in context a little bit. As we said at the beginning, right now, aviation accounts for 2.5% of global emissions. And that's notwithstanding the fact that the aviation industry, since about 1960, has had about a 75% improvement in its fuel efficiency. So the industry is not starting from zero now.
Yeah.
It's had this enormous history of improving its fuel efficiency and thereby improving its emissions intensity.
Right.
And not only that, but the aviation industry had committed to adopting both new technology and new operational procedures that would continue to reduce emissions by about 1% per year indefinitely.
Okay.
That's very expensive to do, but they committed to do that. The problem is that the growth in demand for aviation services by the people who want to fly is occurring at a rate of about 4 to 5% per year in many countries. And globally, it's occurring at a rate that's at least twice what can be achieved through the application of technology and other operational improvements to reduce emissions. So the question is, if we can't get to that level of emissions reduction that is desired as a result of the Paris Agreement or CORSIA or other mechanisms like that, if we can't accomplish that through pricing techniques, then how are we going to do it? I mean, and the governments are essentially saying that ultimately we're going to have to find a way to impose volumetric controls on flights. The CORSIA program is a pricing program. It's a way basically to make airline operations more expensive, and therefore to force airlines to have to increase the airfares for passengers and increase the air freight costs. That has a dual effect. When you do that, it makes it more expensive to fly, so people, everything else equal, will fly less. If you continue to do that, you will drive some airlines out of business, and that will reduce emissions. But you reach a point at which pricing alone won't accomplish the emissions reductions that you're aiming at. And that's where they are with the global aviation. So notwithstanding the fact that we're only talking about 2.5% of the globe's emissions, if they want to achieve the flattening of that particular curve, they will eventually have to get to the point where they actually impose volumetric restrictions on flights. You mentioned, you used earlier the term of the central planning approach. This is a quintessential central planning approach that would be applied here. If the governments get to the point where they say, okay, we're going to force a reduction in the use of airline services, then the only way that you can do that is through a regulation that basically imposes a form of rationing. Right now, that is considered to be politically impossible. But again, if you go through the logic of this, that is inevitably where they will have to go if they're going to be able to achieve the kind of emissions reductions they're talking about. The truly ironic thing about all of this is that the green groups, the organizations that are extremely effective in Canada and Europe and elsewhere, are saying it's not enough.
Yes.
It's not enough.
That is scary, isn't it?
Because, I mean, what the CORSIA program is intended to do is basically to ensure that global aviation emissions do not increase by more than 20% from 2020 levels, going right out to 2050.
And they've been projected higher than that.
Oh,
So
yeah,
this
they've been projected to double. It would double.
Yeah.
So obviously what's being talked about is a very significant reduction in projected emissions. But the climate alarmists, if I can use that term to summarize them, are saying in the marine industry, international marine industry, you have gotten industry to commit to a 50% reduction in emissions from 2020 level. Why don't you impose that on aviation as well?
Wow.
Now, of course, they're totally different industries, totally different technologies involved. Right. The only commonality is that they both tend to use oil-based fuels to move. Yeah. But the alarmists are so committed to this goal that they may well undercut the credibility of the CORSIA regime by saying that it's just not enough.
They'd actually want net zero. Some people.
Yes.
And this I've actually read this on, I'm not sure if you're familiar with the World Economic Forum.
Yes.
Right. So they also have this idea of how they'd like to reshape industry globally, called the Great Reset. Mm-hmm. And so Klaus Schwab actually authored a book called COVID-19, The Great Reset. I'm not sure if you've read that.
No.
I don't think I want to.
What a sad commentary. No, seriously, to look at a global pandemic that now has involved the deaths of millions of people, and the shutdown of the economy with the cost which is now running to many trillions of dollars, and to view that as a positive development is a product of a truly
malevolent.
Malevolent mind. Yes, that's a good word.
Yeah, thank you for saying that.
Yeah.
I agree, and I think many people do, but I think that it's also wrapped in a beautiful package, and there's a lot of money going into advertising this whole campaign. And there is a strong emphasis, as I've talked about in my mini-series, Aviation Hijacked, I went into that a little bit deeper. There's a very strong emphasis on how aviation is inherently unable to meet net zero emissions, mm-hmm. and therefore it should be avoided. That's a very scary thing to think about. So, except for, of course, the 1,500 private jets that flew to the World Economic Forum conference at Davos last year.
Private jets are exempted from CORSIA.
They are, and certain people are exempted from CORSIA.
Yes, indeed.
Okay, no, I wasn't actually aware. So they are exempted from CORSIA. There
Yes.
you go. So that's interesting, isn't it?
Yeah, you just mentioned something else that I wanted to touch upon, and that relates to the opportunities for some people to make money out of this. The primary mechanism for CORSIA is the establishment of regulatory limits on the emissions that a given airline might have within a 3-year period, mm-hmm. And then a requirement that's imposed on the company to purchase offsets, which are credits, right. On the international market, to make up for any shortfalls right. between what the emissions they've created and what they were allowed to emit. That kind of a system only works if you have a fairly large number of organizations that are selling credits.
Right.
And the sellers of credits tend to be environmental organizations, environmental industries like renewable energy industries, electric vehicle industries, forestry industries, and others. So, for example, if I'm a forestry company and you want to assuage your guilt about flying, you can come to me and you can buy the right for me to plant, let's say, 10 trees
In my name.
in your name
Wow.
to
How
offset
hubristic.
your flight,
Right.
or it'll likely be a lot more than 10 trees.
Very
And
narcissistic, actually.
well, I mean, it can be very profitable for the forestry company. So they say they're going to plant those trees for you, and they give you a coupon, and you trade that in to demonstrate that you have
And then I
met
feel
your
better
goal.
as well. I go
And
with my
you-
cloth bag to the grocery store.
yeah,
And I'm
you
ready.
feel better. But what happens if the forestry company is a scam? The emissions trading system that is caught up in the offsets regime is very similar to the um, credits that are being bought and sold as part of the emissions trading system in Europe. And that has
Interesting.
been notoriously vulnerable to scams. In 2016, there was a major court case, in fact, in France, because it was discovered that something like $5 billion had been extorted through the false use of credits.
Wow.
Now, these offset regimes are vulnerable to exactly the same kinds of scams. So that, once again, underlines kind of the problems that are associated with trying to use a pricing regime to accomplish the goals that you're talking about.
Sure. It's not actually about good intentions, or maybe for some people who are naive enough, they actually are environmentalists, and I think that these policies will be helpful when, in fact, they actually end up being very anti-friendly. And at the same time, you know, you always have to follow the money. At the end of the day, there's always going to be somebody benefiting highly from these kind of schemes. Seems to be no exception here.
If you look across the board at the range of government policies that have been implemented to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and the subsidies that have been provided, the regulations that have been implemented, behind almost all of them, you will find that there are a number of industries that are making a great deal of money out of this.